Hi, and welcome to another tutorial on the stat system. You might notice something different in this tutorial in that we are now in Unreal Engine 5. Now we can just continue freely from the Unreal Engine 4 stat system tutorial because as far as this toolkit is concerned, basically nothing has changed going from Unreal Engine 4 to Unreal Engine 5. No older tutorials have become outdated because of the switch. It hasn't affected any of the code, and everything is still in the same places as was the case before, so we can just continue on. So in this tutorial I will be covering statuses and traits, which are like stats, but they can also come with their own logic, so they can do much more complex stuff. We can see some examples of this if we go to our strategy RPG map and look at some of the statuses that we are using here. If we hit play, then we can see that these guys here, they have a retaliate trait, which means that when they're attacked they will attack back. They have a venomous trait, which will deal poison damage whenever they deal damage, and they have a flying trait, so they can move through obstacles. So if I attack this one, you'll see the retaliation. So got a critical hit, and you'll see poisoned here, and poisoned is an example of a status. So you can see the status here, so this one deals damage equal to the stack size of the poison at the end of each turn. So traits and statuses, they aren't really different. When it comes to how the game logic works, it's really only where they are displayed in the UI, and also like some assumptions about how I expect people to use them. But you're of course free to modify this kind of stuff. But what I'm thinking is that, traits are sort of stable stuff that the unit has constantly, and you probably don't want to have like a value associated with them, while statuses, which you will think of are also like status effects, that are things that temporarily affect your unit during combat and likely have numbers that can vary, maybe not. So that's how I'm thinking of when I put these into different categories. But I'll show how all of this works under the hood, so you'll see that they are more or less the same thing. It's just how we treat them. And both statuses and traits are also stats. So we set them up in much the same way as we did with stats in the previous tutorial. But we also add some more stuff to them as well. So let's get to that. We will make use of the simpler stat system map again for this. So we can start more basic. And we'll also leverage the stuff that we added in the last tutorial. If it's been a while, and there was a while between the two tutorials I made, so I can understand that. What we made was this damage multiplier stat, which means that the damage we deal with an attack is multiplied by this amount, and also that if we move, this multiplier increases further, so now we deal triple damage, and which means we deal 105 instead of the 35 damage this guy would normally do. So that's what we added for stats. What I'm thinking is that we'll make use of this, and we'll have like a trait which increases our damage multiplier. Maybe it's something like a rage trait or something, that when one of these units take damage, then they get a temporary status effect which grants them a damage multiplier. So that way we'll be able to see both traits and statuses, and we can also build upon stuff we already have, so we can do it a bit quicker. Okay, so back to data then. We want to again start by adding a stat tag, so we'll make a new one for this new trait that we're making, and let's call this, was it rage? I decided, so let's call it rage. Why not? And for this, we also want to specify then that this is a trait. So this is mostly for organizational purposes. And then, so stat trait rage. You'll see that retaliate is also that under stat and trait, right? We don't have any statuses here actually. We do have that in the strategy RPG one. I'll get to that when we'll make a status effect. Okay, so we have this stat tag, but it doesn't do much in itself. We're going to need a stat as well for this. Though we don't have all the stuff we need for it yet, but let's start with what we know. So we'll do then rage, and we'll also set this to rage here. I mean, we don't really need a friendly name since we'll be using this anyway, but if you're doing localization or something, this is a text variable, so can be useful to set up the names here. So status, this we're gonna add. I'm gonna get to that. So this one doesn't need to be like maxable, like health or something, where we wanted to have like a max value that we can't go beyond. Icon, we won't need that for a trait because that's not how we're displaying it in our UI. And then we have to specify here what type this is. I'll keep it at stat for now, and we'll see. And we'll say that this can be 0. We'll have no tooltips or anything. Let's just keep it like this. And we'll add this to our heavy unit. So then we are in units. Let's go to heavy. Or let's add this to our medic. Why not? Let's have an angry medic. So we'll add the rage traits, and we'll put like a value of say 2. Why not? We'll get back to tweaking the stuff later, but we'll just see that this works. So now if we look at our medic, you'll see that he has a rage of 2. So at the moment this is a regular stat, right? So if we want this to display in our traits section, then we'll go to our stats, we'll find the rage here, and we'll change this from stat to stat and trait in the type. And now if we hit play, you'll see that we have the rage trait here. And the rage trait currently does nothing, it just says rage. Actually, the flying trait that you'll see in the strategy RPG map is the same. It says flying and it has a tooltip and everything, but the trait itself actually does nothing. That's just the pathfinding type that I've given that unit, which is causing it to be flying. And then I just added a trait so this can be described and understood by the player. So that's another way you can basically create an empty trait, which is just a name and a tooltip to explain some sort of gameplay effect to the player. But that is not our plan this time around. So if we want some sort of gameplay effect, something that this trait or status does on its own, not just when it's referenced by other stuff like we did in the last video, where the attack ability is referencing the damage multiplier stat to do something. Here we want the trait to do something on its own. So for that we're gonna need to add a status. So statuses are components that are added to units and that can run game logic on their own. And often they are making use of the event system to listen for certain kinds of gameplay events that happen, so that they can then react in some way. So normally the way I'd do this is I'd take one status which is close to the one that we want to use, and I'd duplicate it and use that as a starting point. But just since we're making our first status now, like the status component, let's create one from scratch. And I know that the naming here is a bit confusing because we have stats and statuses and traits, and so statuses is both the tag that I'm using to describe these status effects that are shown in the UI, where traits are a separate thing displayed in the UI. But both of these can make use of these status components, which are the ones that are actually relevant in doing something different in terms of gameplay. So I hope that isn't too confusing. It was hard to get a good nomenclature for this stuff, but anyway, let's create a new status. So we'll search for status, and then we'll have the status component here, not the old status effect system, but this is for the new stat system. So we'll do this, and we'll call this BP status rage. So this will handle our gameplay. So we open this up and we'll get this nice blank graph here with not much to go on. So it can also help, even though we didn't duplicate anything, to open something that's similar so we can see how stuff is done. So in this case, we want to increase damage multiplier when we take damage, right? So that's not too different from retaliation, so attacking back when we are attacked. So let's take a look at how things are done here. So we'll see here that statuses, they have this event which is called server setup status, which is called on the server immediately when a status is being added or is created. And for the retaliate status, what we can see is that well, first it just stores the owning unit, just for simplicity's sake, for some later stuff here, so we don't have to do lots of casting. But the most relevant part here is that it binds to events. And if you haven't seen my tutorial on the event system, you should do this now, because that's what we're gonna make use of. So we're binding to a couple of different gameplay events here, that after we are attacked, this event unit attacked post, so post an attack, then we want to do something. So after this unit is attacked, and then we run all of the logic which causes this unit to do a counterattack. And then we are also binding to turn start. So at the start of the turn, it uses this turn to 0. And this is something that is made use for in retaliate, to keep track of how many retaliations we have done, because in the strategy RPG game, we only want each unit to be able to do 1 retaliation attack per turn. And you can also see here that one of them is bound to a local event and one of them is bound to a global event. So this is the global turn start event. So whenever a full game turn starts, and this one is when this specific unit is attacked, since we are binding to a local event, to the local dispatcher hub of the unit which owns this status. If we bound this to a global dispatcher hub, then this would fire every time any unit has been attacked. And you could then filter out over here and make sure that this only continues and actually applies the retaliation effect when the owner is attacked. But this way it doesn't get called more often than necessary, so that's easier both for debugging and better for performance. But okay, that was quite a digression, but this explains some of the stuff we're going to make use of in our rage status now. So for this rage status, so first we want to have this server setup status, because we also want to bind to some events when this status is created. It doesn't only have to be bindings and stuff that happens here. You might have other sorts of stuff immediately when a status is applied, you want to do some other kind of gameplay effect, right? And you could also do this here. And since it's on the server, you could spawn actions and do whatever you want there. So this is like a virtual event. It doesn't have anything that happens on the parent. We can do that by checking out the parent component, just this status component. You'll see in the event graph that this one does nothing, so we don't have to call the parent event. We can just run whatever we want here, and then we want to bind to some event. And we actually want to do like the same thing that we did for retaliate, that after this unit is attacked, we want to increase its damage. So let's do that, and we can then use this bind event. You can see that this is here, by the way, in the status component, bind to local events from owner. And you can also look how this works. We're just getting the owner and we're getting the dispatcher hub component from that and binding to this. But this is just a quicker way to do the same thing. So we'll bind to local events from owner, and we'll find this post unit, this unit attacked post. So now whenever this unit attacked post event is called, we will be running an event on this status here. And like when you're trying to figure out, okay, where is this thing actually being called, then I might have, this is always useful to know, I might have covered this in other tutorials as well, but just searching for this tag, and then searching in all blueprints, and then we'll be able to figure out when this is being called. So we can see here that it is bound here and it is called here. So we see within stats attack. So this is one place. So in this stats attack ability, at the end of its execution, it will call this event unit attacked post. And we also see that the calling object will be, the unit that is being attacked. The target of this executability attack is the calling object. And it also passes through the owning unit as a payload. So this means that within the event we can access both the unit that has been attacked and the attacking unit if we need to have access to both of these in the event. But we won't need to have access to both here. It's not play event, it's what is it again? It's run event. Yeah, it's play action and run event. I think I chose that because actions are visual and therefore you're thinking of playing them more like a movie. But maybe consistency would be better. But yeah, anyway, that's what they're called. So we're running an event. Since we are only bound to one event here, we don't really have to do a switch, but I prefer to do it just for clarity's sake, not just for the tutorial. Within anything I add also just to make it very clear what it is we are doing here, so we don't have to go and look for the bind event to understand what we're doing. So there we don't need like a default pin, we are just using this one. So when the unit which has this rage status or this rage trait is attacked, we want to add damage multiplier to this unit. And which unit are we adding it to? We're adding it to the calling object, right? Because remember, the calling object for this event was the attacked unit. So we can just get the calling object. We could also get the owner of this status, would do the same actually, but we can get the calling object as well. And then we'll do add to stat, and we'll add to our damage multiplier. And let's say that we're adding the stat value of our rage trait here to damage multiplier. So we can have different kinds of rage traits then in theory, which give greater multipliers. So this is actually enough to have a simple status. Now we just have to actually implement this. So let's go to our stats and we'll find this rage stat, and we have to tell this rage stat which status component it is associated with, and then we can choose that within status here. So then we'll find rage, there it is, and now when this rage stat is added to anything, then this stuff will be called. So then the binding will happen whenever this stat has been added to anything. And for our units we have already added rage to this guy. So now if this works, we should see that this guy currently has no damage multiplier. He does have the rage trait, and if we do an attack we can now see that he has a damage multiplier, and if he attacks we'll see that he does 70 damage. So that worked. You may have noticed that when that happened we had no sort of text, or I can show it again, like when we deal damage you get this damage number, but there's no indication to the player that the damage multiplier of this guy has increased. So we have to tell the puppet that we want to display this stat as well. So we can do that simply. So this one is using stats puppet, and within stats puppet you'll find the status splash component, and within here you can see the stats to show gameplay tag container, and here we can choose our damage multiplier. And if we do this, that means that whenever damage multiplier is changed, we will see that in game. So we can see that now when we attack, then damage multiplier is increased. And would be the same when we're moving, because we still have the old code from the last tutorial. Yeah, damage multiplier increases when you move as well. Okay, next let's go to creating a status. Now, like I said, they're not really different from traits. It's mostly how they're displayed. And I think we can just turn our damage multiplier stat into a status here. Let's make it so that the rage trait, it adds a damage multiplier status, and the status, it just is applied to your next attack. So you have like this temporary status effect damage multiplier, which gives you damage to your next attack and then is removed, which will, you know, fit well with the idea of a status effect. Well, in my mind at least. You're of course free to define this stuff as you prefer. But for this, then let's turn our damage multiplier stat into a status. So instead of type stat, we'll choose type status instead. And this will cause damage multiplier to show up here. So you see that it has a value of 2, but it is invisible. We're gonna need to have, you know, an icon to show this. So in stats, we will find an icon, and yeah, let's show the engine content. Yeah. These two trusty old icons, always good. This can work for a damage multiplier, right? So let's choose this. This will mean that we get this little icon, and let's add a tooltip as well. So let's go to the stats, and so damage multiplier increases damage of its next attack, or well, multiplies equal to the stack size, something like that. And now we can see that tooltip. So this is all fine. Now it is a now it looks as a status instead of just a stat. If we attack, we see that it's added here, but currently it doesn't do the thing we wanted to do. We just wanted to apply to the next attack, right? So that means that we are going to need for this damage multiplier to have its own logic, and you know by now what that means. That means that we're going to have to create a status component for this stat. This time around, I'm gonna use another status as our starting point. We can actually use our rage for this. We'll just duplicate it, and then we'll call this then damage multiplier. And within here, so now we want it to be that after you have done an attack, then this status disappears. So we'll search for another event, and for this case, I know that that is unit attacked. Let's see. No, I mean unit attacking post. So after this unit is attacking, so the unit owning the status has attacked. After that, then we want to remove the status, and then we have to change this one as well to unit attacking. So, and yeah, we don't want to add to stat this time. So for the calling object, which again should be the owner, but yeah, like I said, we can also just get the owner of this status as well, if that's clearer, and it probably is. Then we will remove the status, and the way we generally will remove a status is to set that, or one way to do it is to set the status value to 0. And by setting it to 0, we can also show some other stuff with statuses and stats. So let's do that, and then damage multiplier. We're setting damage multiplier to 0. And now to actually apply this to our stat, we have to go back to our stats, go back to damage multiplier, and see that we are using the damage multiplier status. So let's see if this works. So I have the damage multiplier effect here, and when I attack, yeah, it gets removed, though it is still here, as you see. And now with a value of 0. The reason for that, if we go to stats, we see that for our damage multiplier, it is allowed to be 0. And for this status effect, I don't think it makes sense that this should remain even if it has a value of 0. So we'll put this to remove when 0. So if we do that, and we attack, now we see that the stat is gone. We have the stat here, right? When we attack, we can also see that it goes to -2, right? And that it is gone. I think that's actually most of the important stuff. We can look at stats here to see if it's anything that I haven't covered, and there are some things. For instance, you have color. So this really just tells the stat splash system what color to paint the text when a status is changed. So if we change this, to be like magenta, now when we change damage multiplier, we'll get like magenta text. And then we have some other stuff. So suffix, I covered this in the last tutorial. Random added to, yeah, this is actually purely visual. This is something I added when you want to have stats that have random ranges, which is the case for the damage stat in the let's see, the strategy RPG map. We can see that here. That our let's see, our damage, yeah, it goes from 4 to 6, right? And that's because this Fey actually has two different stats. We can see that in data and units here. So you'll see that the Fey, it has a damage stat of 4, and it also has a random damage stat of 2. And we'll see how this works in the stats here in SRPG. So random damage, it doesn't have much stuff in it, but it is set to type stat hidden. So that's the thing I haven't covered. If you set something to stat hidden, then it does not show up in the UI at all. And random added to, you can see stat damage. So this means that this stat here will add itself as a range to another stat, which is why when this Fey unit has a damage of 4 and a random damage of 2, it's gonna show up as a damage of 4 to 6, right? So that's all that is for. It doesn't actually do anything gameplay wise on its own, mind you. Let's see. So this does nothing but just tell the UI to do this. You have to go into your attack ability and tell the attack ability to get both the damage value and the random damage value and add them together. So that's just for the UI. See, stat removal. I mean, these are pretty self-explanatory, right? So will it stick around when it is 0? Can this stat be negative? Things like that. Icon, I've told all about this. Maxable, if we want this to have a sort of max value. If it's maxable, then the starting value will be assumed to be the max for that unit. So if we look at any of the units here, they have a health value of 15. Since health is set in stats RPG, or in just stats I mean, to be maxable, that means that the game will assume that 15 is the max. So if we try to do any sort of like heal effect and we go beyond that, we can look at the max to avoid going beyond this max. And then you can change the max by set status max. Gameplay tags can be added to a stat which has a status which will be which you will have access to in that status, which can be useful if you want to have some stats that you tag as like debuffs and others like buffs, and then maybe you want to have some other effect that removes debuffs but keeps buffs, etc. Then you can have these sorts of identifiers. They can also be used for other kinds of stuff, but that's briefly described this stuff. So I think that should cover all of it. I hope it was reasonably clear. And I hope you guys have fun creating your own stats, statuses, and traits. And if you have any questions, have any exciting stats or traits or whatever you want to create, then and are struggling to do so, or just want some input, feel free to ask me in the Discord or the support thread, and I'll be happy to help you along. Okay, see you in the next tutorial.